Right now, as you lie still in the dark, a voice is speaking inside your head. It is reading these very words. And that voice, the one you have heard every waking moment of your life, is not merely a thought. It is a physical event. Your brain's motor cortex is firing right now, moving the muscles of your tongue and throat in micro-contractions so small you cannot feel them. You are whispering to yourself without making a sound. You have been doing this since you were a child, and you have never once been able to stop. You are, in the most literal neurological sense, never alone. Tonight, that changes nothing. But tonight, you will finally understand why. Over the next 2 hours, we are going to walk through 100 quiet revelations about the companion who lives behind your eyes. This is a journey into what psychologists call covert speech, the silent language your mind uses to think, to plan, to worry, to dream. It is the voice that Vygotsky first described over a century ago, the internalized dialogue of a child who once spoke every thought aloud and slowly, year by year, learned to fold that conversation inward until it became invisible. But it never disappeared. It only became quieter, and it has been shaping everything you do ever since. You will learn why you speak to yourself in the second person when you are afraid. You will discover how your inner voice rewrites your memories while you sleep, editing the story of who you are without your permission. You will understand why some thoughts arrive as words and others arrive as images, and what that difference reveals about the architecture of your mind. Each fact is a step closer to knowing the narrator who has told you the story of your entire life. Each quiet truth is a way to turn that voice from a restless critic into something softer, something closer to a lullaby. And if you feel yourself drifting before we reach the 100th fact, that is not failure. That is the point. As your internal monologue fades and your thoughts lose their shape, your subconscious will keep listening. It always does. The voice inside you never stops paying attention, even when you are no longer awake to hear it. So, settle in. Let your breath slow. Let the muscles behind your tongue finally rest. This is a meeting with yourself, and it begins now. There is a whisper happening inside your skull at this very moment. It is not a metaphor. As you listen to these words, your vocal cords are making movements so small that no microphone on earth could capture them. The muscles of your tongue are shifting by fractions of a millimeter, pressing lightly against the roof of your mouth as though preparing to speak, then stopping just short of sound. This is called subvocalization, and it is the physical signature of your inner voice. Every thought you have ever articulated silently, every sentence you have rehearsed before saying it aloud, every argument you have replayed in the shower, has left a faint muscular trace in your throat. Your body does not know the difference between thinking a word and saying it. To your larynx, the intention is identical. The only thing that stops the sound from escaping is a last-second signal from your brain, a quiet cancellation order that arrives just in time to keep your thoughts private. Scientists first confirmed this in the 1930s, when a researcher named Edmund Jacobson attached sensitive electrodes to the throats of people who were asked to think silently. What he found was remarkable. Every time a subject imagined speaking, the electrical activity in their laryngeal muscles spiked in patterns that closely mirrored actual speech. The inner voice was not an abstraction. It was a motor event, a ghostly rehearsal of the real thing. Later experiments refined this discovery, showing that the tongue, the lips, and even the jaw all participate in silent thought. When you read a book in your head, your tongue traces the consonants. When you imagine singing, your vocal folds tense in the correct pitch intervals. You are, in every meaningful sense, talking to yourself all day long. Your body simply learned, somewhere in early childhood, to turn the volume all the way down. This raises a question that neuroscientists have been circling for decades. If the inner voice is a motor act, then somewhere in the brain there must be a region responsible for producing it. A factory where silent sentences are assembled before they arrive in your awareness. That region exists. It is called Broca's area, and it sits in the left frontal lobe of your cortex, just above and behind your left eye. Broca's area is one of the most studied structures in all of neuroscience, because when it is damaged, people lose the ability to produce speech. But what is less commonly known is that Broca's area does not rest when the mouth is closed. Brain imaging studies have shown that it activates robustly during inner speech, assembling words and grammar in the same way it does when you speak aloud. Your inner voice is not a recording. It is being generated in real time by the same neural machinery that moves your lips. What makes Broca's area even more fascinating is that it does not work alone. When you think in words, a network of regions lights up across your brain, forming a circuit that links language production to language comprehension, motor planning to auditory imagination. Broca's area sends its silent draft forward to the prefrontal cortex, where meaning and intention are evaluated, and simultaneously backward to the auditory cortex, where the words are heard as though they had been spoken aloud. This loop, sometimes called the phonological loop, is the neural highway on which your inner voice travels. It is the reason you can hold a phone number in your head by silently repeating it, and the reason a catchy song can lodge itself in your awareness for hours. The loop does not require external sound. It generates its own, a kind of neural echo that your brain treats as real. The Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky was perhaps the first to truly understand where the inner voice comes from. In the 1930s, working in Moscow during a period of extraordinary intellectual ferment, Vygotsky observed something that every parent notices, but few think to question. Young children talk to themselves constantly. A 3-year-old building a tower of blocks will narrate every action out loud. She will say, "I need the red one," and then, "No, that is too big," and then, "There, it fits." This running commentary is not a sign of immaturity. Vygotsky argued that it is the most important cognitive tool a child possesses. The child is using language to regulate her own behavior, to plan, to problem solve, to direct her own attention. She is, in effect, being her own teacher. Vygotsky called this phenomenon private speech, and he proposed something radical about its fate. He believed that private speech does not disappear as children grow older. It goes underground. Between the ages of roughly 5 and 8, the child's out-loud narration becomes quieter, then becomes a whisper, then becomes a movement of the lips with no sound, and finally becomes purely internal. The inner voice of an adult, Vygotsky argued, is simply the private speech of childhood that has been fully internalized. This means that the voice in your head right now, the one following these words, was once a voice you spoke aloud in a room full of toys. It was once audible. It was once external. And over the course of several years, your brain learned to fold it inward, compressing it into a silent stream that runs beneath every conscious moment of your life. You did not develop an inner voice, you swallowed one. Modern research has confirmed Vygotsky's insight with striking precision. Studies of children in the transitional phase between overt and covert speech show that the shift is not sudden, but gradual, like a radio being turned down one notch at a time. At age 4, a child solving a puzzle will speak every step aloud. At age 6, the same child will mutter under her breath, her lips moving, but her voice barely audible. At age 8, the muttering stops, but sensitive equipment can still detect muscular activity in the throat. By age 10, even that trace has faded for most tasks, and the speech has become fully covert. But it has not become less important. If anything, it has become more so. The inner voice of an adult carries the full weight of self-regulation, self-reflection, and self-identity that once belonged to the child's open narration. One of the most curious properties of the inner voice is that it often speaks to you in the second person. When you are nervous before a presentation, the voice does not typically say, "I am going to do well." It says, "You are going to do well." When you are angry at yourself for a mistake, the voice says, "You should have known better." This shift from first person to second person is not random. Psychologist Ethan Kross and his colleagues at the University of Michigan have shown that self-distancing language, speaking to yourself as though you were someone else, measurably reduces emotional reactivity. When people use their own name or the word "you" in their inner dialogue, brain scans show decreased activity in the medial prefrontal cortex, a region associated with self-referential rumination. The inner voice, it seems, has learned a trick. By addressing you as though you were another person, it creates a sliver of psychological distance, just enough to let you think more clearly. This leads to a deeper question about ownership. How does your brain know that the inner voice belongs to you? After all, it arrives in your awareness as a stream of words, much like an external voice might. The difference is that your brain generates a prediction every time it produces inner speech, a kind of advanced copy of what the voice is about to say. This prediction is sent from the motor regions to the auditory cortex, and when the inner speech arrives, the brain compares the two. If they match, the experience is tagged as self-generated. If they do not match, the experience feels alien, as though someone else is speaking. This mechanism is called the efference copy, and it is the reason you cannot tickle yourself. Your brain predicts the sensation before it arrives, and the prediction cancels out the surprise. Your inner voice works the same way. It feels like yours because your brain saw it coming. When the efference copy system breaks down, the consequences are profound. In certain psychiatric conditions, particularly in some forms of psychosis, the brain's prediction mechanism fails to tag inner speech as self-generated. The result is that a person's own thoughts arrive without the stamp of ownership. They sound external. They sound like they belong to someone else. This is one of the leading neurological explanations for the experience of hearing voices, a phenomenon that affects roughly 5 to 8% of the general population to some degree, and a much higher percentage of individuals with schizophrenia. The voices are not imaginary in the sense of being invented from nothing. They are the person's own inner speech, arriving without the brain's usual signature of authorship. The voice is real. It is theirs, but the tag that says, "This came from me," has been lost in transit. Even in healthy minds, the boundary between inner and outer speech can blur in interesting ways. Have you ever been reading a book and suddenly realized that you have been hearing the author's voice in your head, not your own? Or have you noticed that when you imagine a conversation with someone you know well, your inner voice shifts to mimic their intonation, their rhythm, their word choices? This is because the inner voice is not a single, fixed entity. It is a flexible simulation engine that can impersonate others, adopt different accents, and even change its emotional register depending on the context. Your brain's language network does not distinguish sharply between producing your own speech and simulating someone else's. The same regions activate for both, which is why imagined conversations can feel so vivid that they produce real emotional responses, real increases in heart rate, real flushes of adrenaline. The auditory quality of the inner voice is itself a mystery worth pausing over. When you think in words, you do not merely know what the words mean, you hear them. There is a tone, a pitch, a speed. For most people, the inner voice sounds recognizably like their own speaking voice, though often slightly different, sometimes softer, sometimes more measured. Brain imaging reveals why. During inner speech, the auditory cortex, the same region that processes external sound, becomes active even though no sound waves are entering the ear. Your brain is generating a phantom auditory experience, a sound that exists only in the neural patterns of your temporal lobe. This is not imagination in the loose sense. It is a precise reactivation of the same neural circuits that would fire if you were actually hearing someone speak. This phantom sound has a peculiar relationship with memory. When you recall something someone said to you years ago, you often hear it in their voice, with their specific cadence and emphasis. This is because your auditory cortex stored not just the content of what was said, but the acoustic signature of the speaker. When the memory is retrieved, the full sensory experience is partially reconstructed. The inner voice, in this sense, is not limited to your own voice. It is an entire cast of characters archived in the folds of your temporal lobe, available for recall at any moment. You carry within you the vocal fingerprints of everyone who has ever spoken words that mattered to you. There is a part of your brain that never stops narrating, even when you are not trying to think about anything at all. It is called the default mode network, and it is a collection of brain regions that become active precisely when you stop focusing on the outside world. When you close your eyes and let your mind wander, the default mode network awakens and begins its ceaseless work of storytelling. It replays the past, it rehearses the future, it constructs hypothetical conversations, imagines alternate outcomes, and weaves them all into a loose, drifting narrative that feels like daydreaming but is actually the brain's way of maintaining a continuous sense of self. The inner voice is the soundtrack of this network, the verbal thread that holds the daydream together. The default mode network is most active during the moments between tasks, the pauses in your day when your attention is unmoored. But it does not wait for silence to begin its work. It runs in the background, even while you are focused on something else, like a second screen playing a film you are only half watching. This is why a stray thought can interrupt you in the middle of a sentence. Why a worry about tomorrow can surface while you are reading a recipe. Why a fragment of a song can arrive without invitation. The default mode network is always composing, always narrating, and the inner voice is its instrument. You do not choose when it plays when it pleases, and your only role is to notice or not notice the music. Researchers have found that people who report a rich and active inner voice tend to show stronger connectivity within the default mode network. This does not mean that a busy inner voice is better or worse than a quiet one. It simply means that the architecture of your brain shapes the texture of your internal experience. Some people think predominantly in words, narrating their lives in full sentences. Others think in images, flashes of visual information that carry meaning without language. Still others describe their inner experience as a blend of the two, or as something harder to categorize, a kind of unsymbolized thinking that has content but no clear form. The inner voice is only one dialect of the mind. It is the loudest, perhaps, but it is not the only one. The inner voice has a complicated relationship with emotion. When you are calm, your internal monologue tends to be measured and reflective, observing your experience with a kind of gentle narration. But when you are anxious, the voice changes character entirely. It becomes faster, more repetitive, more insistent. It asks the same questions over and over. What if this goes wrong? What will they think of me? Did I say the wrong thing? This pattern is called rumination, and it represents the inner voice at its most relentless. The neural basis of rumination involves an overactive default mode network coupled with reduced input from the prefrontal cortex, the region that normally applies the brakes to repetitive thought. In anxiety, the narrator loses its editor, and the monologue becomes a loop. But the inner voice is not only a source of worry. It is also the mechanism by which you comfort yourself. When you tell yourself that everything will be all right, when you remind yourself that you have survived difficult things before, when you silently say your own name and speak to yourself with the tenderness you would offer a friend, you are using the same neural machinery that produces rumination, but directing it toward a different end. Self-compassionate inner speech has been shown to reduce cortisol levels, lower heart rate, and decrease activity in the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center. The inner voice is not inherently kind or cruel. It is a tool, and like any tool, its effect depends on how it is wielded. Tonight, as you lie here, you have the option of choosing which version of the voice to listen to. There is a phenomenon that sleep researchers find particularly interesting about the inner voice, and it concerns what happens to it in the moments just before you fall asleep. As you drift from wakefulness into the transitional state known as hypnagogia, your inner monologue begins to lose its coherence. Sentences start, but do not finish. Words arrive that do not belong to any thought you were having. The voice may say something nonsensical, a fragment that sounds meaningful but dissolves the moment you try to examine it. This is not a malfunction. It is the inner voice being gradually released from the control of your prefrontal cortex, like a kite whose string has been let go. In hypnagogia, the narrator is still speaking, but it is no longer following a script. This unraveling of the inner voice at the edge of sleep is one of the most reliable signs that your brain is transitioning from conscious control to the autonomous processes of slumber. Electroencephalography studies show that as the prefrontal cortex quiets down, the language regions continue to fire sporadically, producing fragments of inner speech that have no logical connection to one another. Some researchers believe that these fragments are the raw material from which dreams are assembled. The inner voice does not shut off when you sleep. It changes its role. During the day, it is your narrator, your planner, your critic. At night, it becomes a poet, stringing together images and words with a logic that belongs to the unconscious rather than the waking mind. The inner voice is also deeply involved in the process of reading. When you read silently, your brain does not simply extract meaning from the shapes of letters on a page. It converts those letters into an internal auditory experience, sounding out the words in the voice of your mind. This process is so automatic that it is nearly impossible to suppress. Even speed readers, who claim to have eliminated subvocalization, still show faint muscular activity in the throat when tested with sensitive equipment. The inner voice is the bridge between written language and understanding. Without it, reading would be a purely visual task, like interpreting a code. With it, reading becomes something closer to listening, a conversation between you and an absent author, conducted entirely within the walls of your skull. The speed of the inner voice is another detail worth knowing as you settle deeper into this evening. Most people speak aloud at a rate of roughly 120 to 150 words per minute, but the inner voice is faster. Studies suggest that internal speech operates at approximately 3 to 4 times the speed of overt speech, compressing words, skipping unnecessary syllables, and abbreviating familiar phrases into a kind of shorthand that only you can understand. Vygotsky predicted this. He wrote that inner speech is speech almost without words, meaning that over time, the internal monologue becomes so condensed that a single word can carry the weight of an entire sentence. When you think the word home, you do not need to spell out its meaning. The full emotional and sensory experience of home arrives instantly, carried by a single syllable. This compression is possible because the inner voice does not need to communicate with anyone else. External speech must be explicit, fully formed, and grammatically correct enough to be understood by a listener. Inner speech has no such obligation. It can be fragmented, elliptical, and deeply personal because its only audience is you. This is why your thoughts often feel faster than your ability to express them. The inner voice is operating in a private language, a condensed code shaped by decades of personal experience. And when you try to translate that code into spoken words, the translation is always incomplete. There are thoughts you have had that you could never fully explain to another person, not because they are too complex, but because the inner language in which they were composed does not have an external equivalent. Your inner voice also plays a crucial role in working memory, the cognitive system that allows you to hold and manipulate information in the short term. When you are calculating a tip at a restaurant, remembering a sequence of directions, or trying to keep track of multiple ideas during a conversation, you are relying on the phonological loop, the same circuit that carries the inner voice. The loop works by silently rehearsing information, repeating it to yourself in a rapid internal cycle that prevents it from decaying. Without this rehearsal, short-term memory would collapse within seconds. The inner voice, in this sense, is not a luxury. It is a structural necessity, a scaffolding without which the architecture of your moment-to-moment cognition would simply fall apart. There is one more thing worth knowing before we move deeper into this journey together. The inner voice is not a fixed feature of the human mind. It develops, it changes, and it can be trained. Meditators who practice sustained attention on the breath often report that their inner monologue becomes quieter over time, not silenced, but less insistent, less automatic. Brain imaging of experienced meditators confirms this. Their default mode networks show reduced spontaneous activity, and the connectivity between their language regions and their prefrontal cortices shifts toward a pattern associated with greater voluntary control. This does not mean they have lost their inner voice. It means they have changed their relationship with it. They have learned to listen when they choose and to let the voice pass when they do not. This is, perhaps, the deepest skill a person can develop, the ability to hear the narrator without being ruled by it. And so we arrive at the threshold of the first quarter of this journey. You now know that the voice inside you is not a ghost. It is a physical event, a muscular rehearsal, a neural loop that begins in Broca's area and echoes through your auditory cortex like a sound that never reaches the air. You know that it was once a child's voice, spoken aloud in sunlit rooms, and that it folded inward over the course of years until it became the silent companion it is today. You know that it speaks to you in the second person when you are afraid, and that this small grammatical trick is enough to change the chemistry of your brain. You know that it belongs to you, tagged by an efference copy that says, "This thought is mine." And you know that as you drift closer to sleep, this voice will begin to loosen, to fragment, to speak in riddles that only your dreaming mind will understand. Let it go. It will find its way back to you in the morning, as it always does, ready to narrate another day. There is a voice that lives in the space between your thoughts, and it is not always kind. If you have ever made a mistake and immediately heard a sharp internal reprimand, something like, "How could you be so foolish?" or "You always do this," then you have met the inner critic. It feels like a punisher, an adversary that lives inside your own mind. But neuroscience tells a different story. The inner critic is not your enemy. It is your brain's threat detection system speaking in the only language it knows, the language of warning. The amygdala, that ancient almond-shaped cluster deep in your temporal lobe, does not deal in nuance. It deals in alarm. And when it perceives that you have made an error that could lead to social rejection or physical harm, it triggers a cascade of negative self-talk designed not to hurt you, but to ensure you never make the same mistake again. The problem is that the inner critic does not know when to stop. It was designed for a world in which mistakes carried immediate physical consequences, a world of predators and cliffs and tribal exile. In that world, a harsh internal voice that replayed your errors was genuinely useful. It kept you vigilant. But in the modern world, where most of your mistakes carry no mortal danger, the critic continues to operate at full volume, treating a missed deadline or an awkward comment with the same neurochemical urgency it would assign to a rustling in the tall grass. The cortisol floods your system. The heart rate climbs. The voice repeats its warning again and again, not because the danger is real, but because the machinery that produces the warning does not know the danger has passed. Neuroscientists have traced the inner critic to a specific pattern of brain activity involving the medial prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, two regions that work together to monitor your behavior and flag discrepancies between what you intended and what actually happened. When the gap between expectation and outcome is large, these regions amplify the signal, and the result is experienced as self-criticism. But here is what is important to understand as you lie here tonight. The signal is not a verdict. It is a notification. Your brain is telling you that something did not go as planned, and it is asking you to update your model of the world. The harsh tone of the message is an artifact of evolution, not a reflection of truth. You are not as flawed as the critic suggests. The critic is simply loud because volume was once the only way to survive. One of the most effective tools for quieting the inner critic is something you already encountered in the first part of this journey: the simple act of shifting from first person to second person in your internal dialogue. When the voice says, "I am failing," the emotional weight of those words lands directly on your sense of self. But when you gently rephrase it as "you are struggling right now, and that is okay," something measurable changes in your brain. The medial prefrontal cortex, the region most associated with self-referential processing, shows reduced activation. The emotional charge of the thought decreases. Psychologist Ethan Kross has called this self-distancing, and his research suggests that this tiny grammatical shift is one of the most powerful and underutilized tools in human cognition. You do not need a therapist or a meditation cushion to access it. You only need to change a pronoun. The technique extends even further than the second person. Some researchers have found that using your own name in your inner dialogue produces an even greater distancing effect. Instead of saying, "I need to calm down," or even "you need to calm down," you might silently say your own name, followed by a gentle instruction. This may feel strange at first, as though you are narrating your own life from the outside. But that is precisely the point. By addressing yourself by name, you activate the same neural pathways you would use when thinking about another person. You become, momentarily, both the speaker and the listener, the advisor and the advisee. The emotional turbulence decreases because the brain processes the situation as though it is happening to someone else, someone you happen to care about deeply. This capacity for self-distancing reveals something profound about the architecture of human consciousness. Your brain does not have a single, unified perspective on your own experience. It has multiple perspectives available to it, and the one it adopts at any given moment is shaped by the language you use. First person pulls you into the center of the experience. Second person places you at a slight remove. Third person, using your own name, moves you even further out, to a vantage point that resembles compassion more than crisis. The inner voice is not just a narrator, it is a lens, and you can adjust its focal length simply by choosing different words. Tonight, if a worry surfaces and the critic begins its familiar routine, you might try speaking to yourself as though you were a dear friend lying beside you in the dark. The words do not need to be perfect. The distance is what heals. The inner voice does not only serve as a critic or a comforter, it also functions as a coach. When you are learning a new physical skill, whether it is a tennis serve, a piano passage, or the delicate act of parallel parking, your inner voice provides a running stream of instructions. Bend the knees, watch the ball, turn the wheel now. This is called instructional self-talk, and sports psychologists have studied it extensively. The findings are remarkably consistent. Athletes who use explicit verbal self-instructions during training show faster skill acquisition, greater accuracy, and improved focus under pressure. The inner voice, in these moments, is doing exactly what Vygotsky described in children. It is guiding behavior through language, turning abstract intention into concrete action, step by step. What makes instructional self-talk so effective is that it engages working memory in a way that prevents distraction. When you are silently telling yourself what to do, there is less cognitive space available for irrelevant thoughts to intrude. The phonological loop, that internal rehearsal circuit, is occupied with the task at hand, leaving little room for the wandering mind to pull you away. This is why surgeons sometimes talk themselves through complex procedures under their breath, and why pilots run through checklists not only on paper, but in the silent theater of their minds. The inner voice, when directed with intention, becomes a tool of extraordinary precision. It narrows the beam of attention to exactly where it needs to be, filtering out the noise of the world and the noise of the self. There is another form of self-talk that operates differently from instruction and differently from criticism, and it may be the most important one for this moment of your night. It is called motivational self-talk, and its function is not to tell you what to do, but to remind you that you can do it. When you silently say, "I can handle this," or "you have done harder things than this," or simply "keep going," you are activating a network that links the language centers of your brain to the reward pathways in your ventral striatum. The effect is not merely psychological, it is biochemical. Motivational self-talk has been shown to increase endurance, reduce the perception of effort during physical exertion, and improve performance on tasks that require sustained willpower. The inner voice, when it speaks with encouragement, is not just making you feel better, it is changing the chemistry of your effort. Now, let us turn to one of the most elegant discoveries in the science of self-talk, a finding that belongs to the borderland between psychology and neuroscience. It is called affect labeling, and it is almost absurdly simple. When you experience a strong emotion, fear, anger, sadness, grief, and you silently name that emotion in your inner voice, the amygdala's response to that emotion decreases. The act of saying to yourself, "I am feeling anxious right now," does not make the anxiety disappear, but it measurably reduces its intensity. Brain imaging studies led by Matthew Lieberman at UCLA have shown that affect labeling increases activity in the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, a region that acts as a brake on the amygdala's alarm response. In other words, naming the feeling gives your thinking brain a handle on your emotional brain. The word becomes a lever. The reason this works is that language and emotion operate through partially separate neural systems. And when you bring language to bear on an emotional experience, you shift the balance of processing from the subcortical structures that generate raw feeling to the cortical structures that interpret and regulate it. The amygdala responds to threat with speed and without nuance. It does not pause to ask whether the threat is real or imagined, proportionate or exaggerated. But when the prefrontal cortex is engaged through the act of labeling, it sends inhibitory signals back down to the amygdala, gently dampening the alarm. This is not suppression. You are not pushing the emotion away. You are translating it from the language of the body into the language of the mind. And in that translation, something softens. The fear does not vanish. It simply becomes a feeling you are having, rather than a state you are trapped in. This principle has been applied in therapeutic contexts with remarkable results. Cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most evidence-based treatments for anxiety and depression, relies heavily on the practice of identifying and articulating distorted thoughts. When a therapist asks you to name the cognitive distortion you are experiencing, whether it is catastrophizing, black and white thinking, or mind reading, they are essentially asking you to use your inner voice as a labeling tool. The label creates distance. The distance creates choice. And the choice, however small, is the beginning of freedom from the automatic emotional patterns that the brain falls into when left to its own devices. You do not need a therapist to practice this. You need only the willingness to pause, to listen to the inner voice, and to ask it one quiet question. What am I feeling right now? There is a related technique that researchers have called cognitive reappraisal, and it builds on the foundation of affect labeling by asking the inner voice to do something more ambitious. Instead of simply naming the emotion, you silently reinterpret the situation that caused it. If you are lying awake feeling anxious about tomorrow, your inner voice might say this: anxiety means something is wrong and I need to fix it. Cognitive reappraisal asks you to gently revise that interpretation. You might say instead, this anxiety means I care about what happens tomorrow, and that is not a bad thing. The emotion remains. The physical sensations may persist, but the meaning you assign to those sensations has shifted, and with it, the brain's response. Studies show that reappraisal reduces amygdala activation even more effectively than labeling alone, because it engages the prefrontal cortex not just in naming, but in narrative construction. The inner voice is also the primary vehicle through which you construct your autobiography. Every night, as you review the events of the day, your inner monologue is weaving those events into a story, selecting which moments to emphasize, which to minimize, and which to discard. This process is not neutral. It is deeply shaped by your emotional state at the time of narration. If you are anxious, the inner narrator tends to highlight threats and failures. If you are at peace, it tends to notice kindness and connection. The story you tell yourself about your day is not a factual record. It is an editorial written by a narrator whose mood colors every sentence. Knowing this does not make the narrator unreliable. It makes the narrator human, and it gives you permission to gently revise the draft before you fall asleep. This is why many sleep researchers and therapists recommend a practice that is sometimes called the gratitude review, though the name undersells its power. Before sleep, you might allow your inner voice to slowly narrate 3 things that went well during the day. Not grand achievements, but small moments of warmth or beauty or simple competence. The practice works not because it erases the difficult parts of the day, but because it gives the inner narrator a different set of raw materials to work with. The default mode network, which will continue processing your day's experiences as you sleep, takes its cue from the last narrative you construct before consciousness fades. If that narrative is one of threat and failure, the sleeping brain will rehearse those themes. If it is one of quiet sufficiency, the dreams that follow tend to be gentler. Let us speak now about what happens to the inner voice at the border of sleep, because you may be approaching that border even now. As the prefrontal cortex begins to disengage, the inner monologue undergoes a transformation that is both strange and beautiful. The problem-solving voice, the one that plans and worries and evaluates, starts to lose its grip. In its place, a different kind of inner speech emerges, one that is more descriptive than analytical, more sensory than logical. Instead of thinking about what you need to do tomorrow, you might find yourself silently describing the weight of the blanket on your body, or the color of the darkness behind your eyelids, or the distant sound of something you cannot quite identify. This shift from analytical to sensory self-talk is one of the most reliable pathways into sleep. Sleep researchers have observed that individuals who naturally engage in sensory self-description at bedtime tend to fall asleep faster than those whose inner monologue remains in problem-solving mode. This is because sensory language activates different neural circuits than analytical language. When your inner voice describes a physical sensation, it engages the somatosensory cortex and the insula, regions associated with bodily awareness, while simultaneously reducing activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the region most associated with executive planning. The net effect is a rebalancing of the brain's activity toward the patterns associated with sleep onset. You can encourage this shift deliberately. Instead of trying to stop thinking, which is nearly impossible and often counterproductive, try redirecting your inner voice toward description. Tell yourself what you feel, not what you think. The body will follow the words. There is a cultural dimension to the inner voice that is rarely discussed but deeply important. The language you grew up speaking does not merely provide the words your inner voice uses, it shapes the very structure of your internal experience. Speakers of languages with rich verb morphology, like Turkish or Japanese, tend to have inner voices that are more action-oriented, organizing experience around what is happening rather than who is doing it. Speakers of languages with elaborate tense systems, like English, tend to have inner voices that are more temporally structured, moving fluidly between past, present, and future. The grammar of your mother tongue is the grammar of your thought, and it colors every sentence your inner narrator has ever spoken. This goes deeper than grammar. The phonological properties of your language, its rhythms, its vowel patterns, its average syllable length, shape the tempo of your inner voice. Studies have shown that speakers of syllable-timed languages like Spanish or French tend to have a more rhythmic, evenly paced internal monologue, while speakers of stress-timed languages like English or German tend to have a more variable, syncopated inner tempo. You have probably never thought about the rhythm of your own inner voice, but it is there, a pulse beneath your thoughts, as constant and distinctive as a heartbeat. It was set in the first years of your life, when the sounds of your native language were carved into the auditory cortex like grooves in a record, and it has been playing ever since. Bilingual individuals offer a fascinating window into the flexibility of the inner voice. People who speak 2 or more languages fluently often report that their inner monologue switches between languages depending on the emotional context. Many bilinguals think in their second language when performing cognitive tasks or discussing abstract ideas, but revert to their first language when they are emotional, tired, or in pain. This is because the first language is typically stored in deeper, more emotionally connected neural circuits, while the second language is processed through more analytical pathways. The inner voice, it seems, chooses its language not randomly, but strategically, reaching for the tongue that best matches the emotional temperature of the moment. There is something else that happens to the inner voice during states of deep relaxation, and it is worth knowing as you settle further into this hour. When the body is fully at rest and the mind is no longer efforting, the inner monologue sometimes shifts from verbal to musical. You may notice a melody surfacing, not a song you are trying to remember, but a fragment that seems to arrive from nowhere, playing in the same internal auditory space that usually hosts your spoken thoughts. This is not accidental. The auditory cortex does not distinguish sharply between speech and music. Both are processed in overlapping regions of the temporal lobe, and when the verbal demands on those regions decrease, musical representations can emerge spontaneously. The inner voice, in its most relaxed state, sometimes stops talking and begins to hum. This musical quality of the inner voice connects to a broader truth about the nature of thought itself. Language is not the only medium of inner experience. It is simply the most articulate one. Beneath the words, there are textures of feeling that have no verbal equivalent, emotional tones that color your awareness without ever resolving into sentences. Some psychologists call this the felt sense, a term coined by Eugene Gendlin to describe the bodily, pre-verbal knowing that underlies conscious thought. The inner voice arises from this felt sense, translating it into words, but the translation is always partial. There is always more to your experience than the narrator can say. And in the quiet of this moment, as the words begin to thin and the felt sense grows louder, you are touching something closer to the raw fabric of your mind. Let us consider what the inner voice does with silence. In a world saturated with noise, external and internal, genuine silence is rare. But when it arrives, when the outer world is quiet and the inner monologue has momentarily paused, the brain does not experience emptiness. It experiences a kind of spacious awareness, a state in which you are conscious but not thinking in words. Meditators describe this state with different names: open awareness, pure presence, choiceless attention. But the neurological signature is consistent. The default mode network reduces its activity. The language regions become quiet, and the brain enters a mode of processing that is more global, more integrated, and more restful than the narrow, word-driven mode that dominates waking life. The inner voice, when it finally rests, makes room for something larger. This is perhaps the deepest gift of the inner voice, that it can choose to be silent. It does not need to narrate every moment. It does not need to evaluate every experience. It does not need to rehearse every future or revise every past. It can simply stop, and in stopping, allow you to experience the world without commentary, without judgment, without the constant hum of self-reference. This is not the absence of consciousness. It is consciousness without its most familiar costume. And it is, for many people, the state that is most closely associated with peace. You do not need to reach it tonight. You do not need to reach it ever. But it is worth knowing that it exists, that beneath the voice there is a listener, and that the listener has been here all along, patient and quiet, waiting for the words to fade. And so let the words begin to fade now. Let the inner critic lay down its sharpened notes. Let the planner close its open files. Let the narrator's voice become softer, slower, less certain of what comes next. You have traveled through the machinery of self-criticism and discovered that it is not malice, but misplaced protection. You have learned that a change of pronoun can change the temperature of a thought. You have heard how naming a feeling gives the thinking brain a gentle hold on the feeling brain. And you have arrived at the edge of a quieter place, where the inner voice no longer needs to instruct or evaluate, where it can simply describe the weight of your body against the surface beneath you, the rhythm of your breath, the darkness that is not empty but full of rest. Let the voice describe these things if it wishes, and if it does not wish, let it rest too. The next part of this journey will be waiting for you, patient as the silence between heartbeats. Somewhere in the world right now, someone is dreaming of a conversation that never happened. They are hearing a voice, perhaps the voice of a person they love, perhaps the voice of a stranger, and that voice is speaking clearly, forming complete sentences, delivering information that feels urgent or tender or strange. And yet there is no sound in the room. There is no vibration in the air. The vocal cords of the dreamer are still. The auditory canal is receiving nothing but the ambient hum of the night. The voice exists entirely within the brain, generated by the same neural architecture that produces the inner voice during waking hours, but freed now from the constraints of logic and intention. In dreams, the inner voice does not serve the self. It serves the story. It becomes a character in a theater that the sleeping brain is both writing and watching at the same time. The neuroscience of dream speech is remarkably precise. During rapid eye movement sleep, the stage in which the most vivid and narrative dreams occur, the auditory cortex becomes active in patterns that closely resemble those observed when a person is listening to actual speech. The temporal lobe processes the dream voice as though it were real, assigning it tone, pitch, rhythm, and emotional weight. Meanwhile, Broca's area, the same region that generates your waking inner monologue, shows intermittent activation, suggesting that the dreaming brain is not merely hearing voices, but producing them. You are, in your dreams, both the speaker and the audience. The conversation is entirely self-generated, and yet it often contains surprises, responses you did not expect, information you did not know you possessed, as though the dreaming mind has access to a deeper library than the waking mind is permitted to browse. One of the most curious features of dream speech is that the dreamer rarely questions its source. When a figure in your dream speaks to you, you do not pause to wonder how they are producing sound without a physical body. You do not notice that the acoustics of the dream room are impossible, that the voice has no echo, no directionality, no spatial origin. This uncritical acceptance is the result of the prefrontal cortex being largely offline during REM sleep. The region of the brain that normally evaluates the plausibility of experience, that performs reality testing, is quiet. And without it, the inner voice is free to assume any identity, speak from any location, and deliver any message without being challenged. The dreaming mind is the most trusting audience the inner voice will ever have. This is why dreams can carry such emotional power even when their content, recalled in the morning, seems absurd. The voice in the dream spoke with conviction, and the sleeping brain believed it completely. A dream in which someone tells you they are disappointed in you can produce genuine grief that lingers for hours after waking. A dream in which a stranger whispers a word of encouragement can leave you feeling inexplicably hopeful. The emotions are real because the auditory cortex processed the dream voice with the same fidelity it would give to an actual human being standing beside your bed. Your brain did not tag the experience as imaginary. It tagged it as heard, and everything that follows from hearing, the emotional response, the memory encoding, the physiological arousal, proceeded accordingly. Let us turn now to a different kind of silent voice, one that accompanies you through every page of every book you have ever read. When you read silently, your inner voice does not simply recognize the words on the page, it performs them. It assigns them a pace, a cadence, a tone of voice that may differ depending on the author, the genre, or the emotional content of the passage. This is subvocalization in its most refined form, not merely a muscular ghost in the throat, but a full auditory simulation in the mind. Reading researchers have found that skilled readers automatically generate an inner voice for the text, and that this voice carries prosodic information, the rises and falls of pitch, the pauses between clauses, the emphasis on certain words that significantly affects comprehension. You do not just read the words, you hear them, performed by a voice inside you that has become, over the years, an extraordinarily versatile actor. The inner voice of reading is not always your own. Studies have shown that when readers encounter text attributed to a specific person, someone whose voice they know well, the auditory cortex generates an internal simulation of that person's voice. If you read a quote from someone whose speech patterns are familiar to you, you will likely hear the words in their voice, with their accent and their rhythm. This is not a conscious choice. It is an automatic function of the brain's capacity for auditory imagery, the same capacity that allows you to hear a melody in your head or recall the sound of rain on a window. The inner voice is, in its reading mode, a mimic of extraordinary fidelity, drawing on the vast archive of voices stored in your temporal lobe to bring the written word to life. There is a question that has only recently begun to receive serious scientific attention, and it is this: what happens in the minds of people who have no inner voice at all? The condition is called anendophasia, and it is more common than most people realize. Roughly 5 to 10% of the population reports having little to no verbal inner monologue. These individuals do not think in words. They do not narrate their experiences silently. When asked what is happening in their minds at any given moment, they describe images, spatial relationships, abstract concepts, or simply a kind of knowing that has no sensory form. They solve problems, make decisions, and navigate complex social situations without the running commentary that most people assume is a universal feature of human thought. The discovery that some people lack an inner voice has forced researchers to reconsider many assumptions about the role of language in cognition. For decades, it was believed that inner speech was essential for working memory, self-regulation, and abstract reasoning. But individuals with anendophasia perform normally on most cognitive tasks, suggesting that the brain has alternative pathways for these functions. Some use visual imagery, where others use words. Some rely on a kind of spatial reasoning, manipulating mental models rather than verbal propositions. The inner voice, it turns out, is not the only way to think. It is one strategy among several, and the brain is flexible enough to substitute others when verbal thought is absent. This does not diminish the inner voice. It simply reveals that the mind is larger than any single mode of expression. For those who do possess a rich inner monologue, the voice serves a function that goes beyond problem solving and self-regulation. It serves as the architect of identity. Every day, your inner voice constructs a narrative about who you are, what you value, where you have been, and where you are going. This narrative is not a recording of facts. It is a story, shaped by emphasis and omission, colored by emotion, and revised continuously in light of new experience. The psychologist Dan McAdams has called this the narrative identity, the internalized and evolving story of the self that each person constructs to make sense of their life. The inner voice is the teller of this story. It is the one that says, "I am the kind of person who," and in that simple phrase, it creates the self it describes. The narrative self is extraordinarily powerful, but it is also, in a certain sense, fictional. Not in the sense that it is untrue, but in the sense that it is selective. Your inner voice cannot narrate everything. It chooses what to include and what to leave out. And those choices are shaped by the themes that have come to dominate your personal story. If your narrative identity is built around resilience, The inner voice will tend to highlight moments of overcoming. If it is built around loss, the voice will tend to linger on what was taken away. Neither version is complete. Both are true. The inner voice is not lying to you when it tells your story in a particular way. It is doing what all narrators do, making meaning from chaos by imposing a pattern on events that, without the story, would simply be things that happened. There are moments when the narrative dissolves entirely. They are rare, but almost everyone has experienced at least one. It might happen during a moment of profound beauty, a sunset that stops you mid-sentence, a piece of music that renders language irrelevant. It might happen during intense physical exertion, when the body's demands overwhelm the narrator's capacity to comment. Or it might happen in a moment of crisis, when time seems to slow and the inner voice goes silent, replaced by a kind of pure, wordless attention. Psychologists call these moments of ego dissolution, and they are characterized by a dramatic reduction in activity in the default mode network, the brain system most closely associated with self-referential thought. When the narrator stops narrating, the sense of being a separate self temporarily fades, and what remains is awareness without a center. These experiences are not pathological. They are among the most valued states in human experience, described across cultures and throughout history as moments of transcendence, flow, unity, or grace. The common thread is the silence of the inner voice. When the narrator pauses, the boundary between self and world becomes thinner, and the rigid sense of I softens into something more permeable. Meditators spend years cultivating this state deliberately, learning to observe the inner voice without following it, letting thoughts arise and pass without engagement. But the state also arises spontaneously, often at the moments when you least expect it, when you are fully absorbed in something that demands your entire attention and leaves no room for commentary. Let us now carefully examine the boundary between the inner voice and something more unsettling, the experience of hearing a voice that does not feel like your own. This boundary, as we touched upon earlier, depends on the brain's efference copy mechanism, the internal prediction that tags self-generated speech as mine. But the boundary is not as solid as you might think. Even in the absence of any psychiatric condition, many people occasionally experience thoughts that arrive with an alien quality, as though they were inserted from outside. A sudden intrusive thought, a phrase that seems to come from nowhere, a voice that sounds subtly different from the usual narrator. These are normal variations in the functioning of the efference copy system, not signs of illness. However, when the efference copy mechanism fails consistently, the result is a phenomenon that clinicians call auditory verbal hallucinations. The person hears speech that they experience as external, as coming from a location in space, often with a distinct identity and emotional tone. Brain imaging of individuals during auditory hallucinations reveals a striking pattern. The auditory cortex is active, as though processing real sound. Broca's area is active, as though producing speech. And the temporal parietal junction, a region involved in distinguishing self from other, shows abnormal connectivity. The voice is being generated internally but experienced externally, a profound breakdown in the tagging system that normally keeps your thoughts recognizable as your own. The content of the voice is the person's own cognitive material. The experience of it as foreign is a neurological error, not a supernatural event. What is less commonly known is that auditory verbal hallucinations exist on a spectrum. At one end are the clinical experiences associated with conditions like schizophrenia, where the voices are persistent, distressing, and resistant to voluntary control. But at the other end are experiences that are far more common and far less alarming. Many people hear their name being called when no one is there, particularly in states of fatigue or high stress. Some hear brief fragments of speech during the transition between waking and sleeping, a phenomenon called hypnagogic hallucination that is considered entirely normal. And some people, particularly those with vivid imaginations or strong auditory processing abilities, report hearing internal voices with a clarity and distinctness that approaches the quality of external sound. The inner voice, in these cases, is simply louder than usual. Not alien, not threatening, just vivid. The relationship between the inner voice and creativity deserves attention here in the quieter waters of this hour. Many writers, composers, and artists describe their creative process in terms that sound remarkably like listening. They speak of characters who talk to them, of melodies that arrive unbidden, of ideas that seem to present themselves fully formed. This is not mysticism. It is a description of what happens when the default mode network is highly active and the prefrontal control regions are relaxed. In this state, the brain generates associations freely, combining stored memories, language patterns, and emotional tones in novel configurations. The inner voice becomes a channel for material that was always present but normally suppressed by the demands of focused, goal-directed thought. Creativity, in this sense, is what happens when the inner voice is allowed to wander without a destination. The inner voice also plays a role in moral reasoning that is seldom discussed but deeply consequential. When you face an ethical dilemma, the inner monologue becomes a kind of courtroom, presenting arguments, weighing consequences, and reaching a verdict that you experience as your conscience. Neuroscience has shown that this moral deliberation involves the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a region that integrates emotional and rational information to produce value judgments. The inner voice is the medium through which these judgments are articulated. You hear yourself saying, "This feels wrong," or "I should help." And that verbal articulation is not merely a commentary on a decision already made. It is part of the decision-making process itself, a way of bringing implicit moral intuitions into explicit awareness, where they can be examined and, if necessary, overruled. There is a quieter function of the inner voice that operates beneath the level of moral deliberation and narrative construction, and it has to do with the simple maintenance of temporal awareness. Your inner voice is constantly placing you in time. It says things like, "Later I need to," or "Yesterday when I," or "Right now this is happening." Without this temporal narration, your experience would be an eternal present, vivid but unanchored, lacking the sense of continuity that makes you feel like the same person who woke up this morning and the same person who will wake up tomorrow. The inner voice is the thread that connects the beads of experience into a necklace, and without it, the beads would scatter into a pile of isolated moments, each complete in itself but disconnected from every other. This temporal function of the inner voice is related to a concept that psychologists call mental time travel, the ability to project yourself backward into memory and forward into imagination. When you remember a conversation from last week, you are not merely retrieving data, you are re-entering the scene, hearing the voices, feeling the emotions, and your inner voice provides the narration that holds the memory together. When you imagine a future event, the inner voice scripts the dialogue, sets the scene, and rehearses your responses. This capacity for mental time travel is believed to be unique to humans, or nearly so, and it depends critically on the interaction between the default mode network and the language system. Without the inner voice, the past would be a collection of images, and the future would be a blank. Let us speak now about silence itself, not the absence of external sound, but the rare and luminous silence that occurs when the inner voice voluntarily ceases. This is the silence that contemplatives have sought for millennia, the silence that lies beneath thought rather than between thoughts. It is not emptiness, it is fullness without form. Neuroscientists studying experienced meditators have found that during states of deep, open awareness, the brain's activity does not decrease overall, it reorganizes. The default mode network becomes less dominant. The salience network, which normally directs attention toward novel or threatening stimuli, becomes quieter. And the brain enters a state of high coherence, with widely distributed regions synchronizing their activity in a way that is not seen during ordinary waking consciousness. In this state, the inner voice is not suppressed. It is transcended. The capacity for language remains intact, but it is no longer the primary mode of experiencing. What takes its place is difficult to describe, precisely because description requires the very language that has been set aside. Meditators use terms like spacious awareness, boundless presence, or simply being. Neuroscience can observe the correlates of this state, the reduced default mode activity, the increased gamma wave synchronization, the altered connectivity patterns, but it cannot capture the quality of the experience from the inside. What can be said is that people who regularly access this state report a lasting change in their relationship with the inner voice. It no longer feels like a compulsory narrator. It feels like an optional tool, available when needed, silent when not. There is a phenomenon that bridges the worlds of meditation and ordinary experience, and it is the state of awe. When you stand before something vast, a mountain range, a star-filled sky, the ocean at night, the inner voice often goes quiet without any deliberate effort. Researchers Dacher Keltner and Jonathan Haidt have described awe as an emotion triggered by perceived vastness that requires accommodation, a revision of your existing mental frameworks to make room for something that does not fit. During awe, the default mode network shows reduced activation, the self-referential chatter diminishes, and the brain enters a state that resembles, in many respects, the silence achieved through contemplative practice. Awe is meditation without technique, a natural dissolution of the narrator provoked by the sheer scale of what is being witnessed. The inner voice has a relationship with the body that extends beyond the throat and the tongue. Research in embodied cognition has shown that the content of your inner speech is influenced by your posture, your breathing, and even the tension in your muscles. When your body is relaxed, the inner voice tends to be slower, more spacious, and more accepting. When your body is tense, the inner voice becomes faster, more clipped, and more critical. This is not a metaphor. The interoceptive signals from your body, the information about heart rate, muscle tension, gut activity, and breath depth feed directly into the brain regions that generate inner speech. Your body is not merely listening to the inner voice. It is co-authoring it. And tonight, as your muscles soften and your breathing deepens, you may notice that the voice inside you is changing its tone to match. This connection between body and inner voice is the basis of many somatic therapies, practices that seek to change the mind by changing the body first. When a yoga instructor asks you to relax your jaw and soften your tongue, they are not merely releasing muscular tension, they are altering the physical substrate of your inner monologue. The tongue and jaw are among the primary articulators involved in subvocalization, and when they release, the inner voice often quiets in response. Try it now if you are still awake. Let your tongue fall away from the roof of your mouth. Let your jaw hang slightly open. Let the muscles around your throat soften as though you have forgotten how to speak. Notice what happens to the voice. It does not disappear, but it may become gentler, less formed, more like a murmur than a monologue. There is one more landscape to cross before this part of the journey ends, and it is the landscape of the liminal. You may already be there, in that soft borderland between waking and sleeping where thoughts lose their sharp edges and meanings become fluid. In this state, the inner voice undergoes its most radical transformation. It ceases to be a vehicle for rational thought and becomes instead a carrier of images, sensations, and fragments of language that follow a logic all their own. A word may appear in your mind, not because of its meaning, but because of its sound. A sentence may begin in one direction and dissolve into color or texture or feeling. This is the hypnagogic voice, the inner monologue in its most ancient and unconstrained form. And it is the last thing you hear before the dream takes over. Let it take over. Let the voice loosen its grammar. Let the sentences become suggestions rather than statements, impressions rather than arguments. You have traveled tonight through the neurology of a companion you have carried since childhood, through the regions of the brain that give it breath and form, through the dreams where it speaks without your permission, and the silences where it finally rests. You have learned that it is physical, that it is flexible, that it is not always yours in the way you assume, and that beneath it there is a quieter awareness that needs no words at all. The next quarter of this journey will meet you wherever you are, awake or asleep, narrating or silent. The voice will be there if you need it, and if you do not, the silence will hold you just the same. You have been listening for a long time now, and the voice inside you has been listening too. It has followed every word, translating the sounds that enter your ears into the silent language of your mind. And somewhere along the way, without your noticing, it began to change. The sentences it forms are no longer crisp. The grammar is softening. A thought begins and does not quite finish, replaced by another that is more feeling than phrase. This is the hypnagogic transition, the neurological threshold between waking and sleeping, and it has a signature that scientists can read on an electroencephalogram. The beta waves of alert cognition are giving way to the slower alpha rhythms of relaxation, and as they do, the prefrontal cortex, that great editor of your thoughts, is loosening its hold on the language centers. The inner voice is still speaking, but it is no longer checking its own work. In the hypnagogic state, the inner voice begins to behave less like a narrator and more like a poet who has stopped caring about coherence. Words arrive not for their meaning, but for their texture. A syllable surfaces because it rhymes with something you heard hours ago. A name appears that belongs to no one you know. A sentence starts with clarity and then bends into an image, a flash of color, the suggestion of a place you may or may not have visited. Researchers who have studied hypnagogic speech by waking subjects at the precise moment of sleep onset and asking them to report their last thought have found that these reports are characterized by loose associations, semantic blending, and a kind of logic that belongs more to poetry than to reason. The inner voice has not gone mad. It has simply been released from the rules. This loosening of language at the edge of sleep is not a failure of the brain. It is a deliberate reorganization. As the thalamus, the brain's sensory gatekeeper, begins to reduce the flow of external information to the cortex, the brain turns its processing power inward. The language network, no longer needed to interpret the outside world, begins to process internal material, memories, emotions, sensory fragments, with a freedom that waking consciousness does not permit. The result is the strange and beautiful confabulation that characterizes the moments before dreams begin. Your inner voice is composting the day, breaking down the structured thoughts of your waking hours into raw material that the dreaming brain will reassemble into something new. Nothing is lost. Everything is transformed. As you move closer to sleep, the default mode network, that restless narrator of your daydreams and worries, begins to quiet in a way that is different from anything that happens during waking hours. During the day, the default mode network can be temporarily suppressed by focused attention, but it always returns the moment your focus relaxes. In the transition to sleep, however, the suppression is deeper and more sustained. The medial prefrontal cortex, which generates the sense of I that anchors your narrative identity, reduces its metabolic activity. The posterior cingulate cortex, which integrates autobiographical memory into a continuous sense of self, begins to disengage. The story of you is being gently set down, like a book placed on a nightstand, still real, still yours, but no longer being read. What remains when the story of the self is set down is a question that neuroscience and philosophy approach from different directions, but with a shared sense of wonder. The neuroscientist observes that consciousness does not vanish when the default mode network quiets. Brain activity continues, but it shifts into patterns associated with what some researchers call a minimal self, a form of awareness that is present but not reflective, that registers experience without commenting on it. The philosopher might call this pure awareness or witness consciousness, the ground state of the mind before it is organized into a personal narrative. You do not need to name it. You only need to know that beneath the story your inner voice tells, beneath the character it has constructed and maintained for your entire life, there is something simpler, something that was aware before you had words and will remain aware long after the words have faded tonight. There is a theory in developmental psychology that deserves to be heard in the quiet of this hour. It holds that your inner voice is not entirely your own creation. It is a composite, a chorus assembled from the voices of the people who cared for you in the earliest years of your life. When your mother told you to be careful, that instruction was internalized, and it became part of the voice that now warns you of danger. When a teacher praised your effort, that encouragement was absorbed, and it became part of the voice that now urges you forward. When someone spoke to you with impatience or disappointment, that tone was recorded too, and it may still surface in the moments when the inner critic is loudest. Your inner voice is not a single speaker. It is a parliament of echoes, and every member was once an external voice that loved or failed you. Recognizing this composite nature of the inner voice is both humbling and liberating. Humbling, because it reveals that the voice you consider most private, most uniquely yours, is in fact a collaborative creation shaped by forces you did not choose. Liberating, because it means the voice can be reshaped. If the critical tone you hear belongs to someone who spoke harshly to you decades ago, you are not obligated to keep amplifying that tone. You can, with patience and intention, introduce new voices into the chorus. The voice of a kind friend, the voice of a therapist, the voice of the person you are becoming rather than the person you were told to be. The inner voice is not fixed. It is a living composition, and you are still adding instruments. At night, when consciousness softens and the barriers between memory and present experience become thin, the ancestral voices in your inner monologue sometimes surface with unusual clarity. You may hear a phrase that belongs to a grandparent. You may catch a cadence that reminds you of a childhood friend. These are not hallucinations. They are the natural emergence of deeply stored vocal patterns that the waking mind usually keeps beneath the surface. Sleep is generous with memory. It allows fragments to rise that the busy, structured daytime mind would never permit. And in this rising, there is sometimes a tenderness, a recognition that the voices you carry are not burdens but inheritances, gifts from people who shaped your mind simply by speaking in your presence. Let us consider now the vast territory of thought that exists beyond words entirely. The inner voice, for all its importance, represents only one layer of your cognitive life. Beneath it, running constantly and without narration, is a deeper processing system that operates through feeling, intuition, and pattern recognition. This system does not think in sentences. It thinks in wholes, grasping the meaning of a situation before language can break it into parts. When you walk into a room and immediately sense that something is wrong, that perception is not coming from the inner voice. It is coming from a network of brain regions, including the insula, the anterior cingulate, and the somatosensory cortex, that processes information too quickly and too holistically for language to capture. The inner voice may arrive a moment later with an explanation, but the knowing came first, wordless and complete. This non-verbal intelligence is older than language itself. Long before humans developed the neural architecture for speech, our ancestors navigated complex social environments, predicted the behavior of predators, and made life or death decisions using this intuitive processing system. It is fast, it is efficient, and it operates entirely below the threshold of verbal awareness. When you trust your gut, you are trusting this system. When you know something without knowing how you know it, you are drawing on millennia of evolutionary refinement that has nothing to do with words. The inner voice is a recent addition to the human cognitive toolkit, perhaps only 200,000 years old. The wordless mind beneath it has been operating for millions of years, and it does not need your narration to do its work. There is a state that experienced meditators describe as awareness without content, a mode of consciousness in which the mind is awake but empty of thought, image, and sensation. Brain imaging of this state reveals a paradox. The brain is highly active, with strong gamma wave synchronization across distributed cortical regions. Yet the default mode network is quiet and the language centers are still. The person is conscious, deeply so, but there is nothing to be conscious of in the usual sense. No words, no images, no self-reference. Some contemplative traditions call this the ground of being, the awareness that remains when everything else has been subtracted. It is not sleep. It is not waking as you normally experience it. It is something else entirely, a third state that suggests consciousness is not dependent on content, that the light can remain on even when the room is empty. You do not need to reach that state tonight. It is mentioned here not as a goal but as a map point, a reminder that the territory of your mind extends far beyond the boundaries of language. Your inner voice has been a faithful guide through waking life, organizing your experience, directing your attention, holding together the narrative of your identity. But it is not the whole of you. It is not even the deepest part of you. Beneath the words, there is a presence that has been with you since before you learned to speak, a knowing that does not require articulation, a stillness that is not the opposite of thought, but the foundation from which thought arises. As you drift now, you are moving toward that foundation, sinking through the layers of language into something older and quieter. The body has its own language of descent into sleep, and the inner voice, if it is still murmuring, tends to mirror that language in its final moments of coherence. As the heart rate slows and the blood pressure drops, the voice becomes less emphatic. As the muscles of the face and jaw release their held tension, the sub-vocalization that underlies inner speech diminishes to almost nothing. As the breath deepens and lengthens, the rhythm of the inner monologue stretches with it, the pauses between thoughts growing longer, the thoughts themselves growing thinner, until the pause is the thought, and the silence between words is wider than the words themselves. The brain is now entering the early stages of non-rapid eye movement, sleep, and the neural signature of this transition is unmistakable. Theta waves, slower and more rhythmic than the alpha waves of relaxation, begin to dominate the electroencephalogram. The thalamus is closing its gates, reducing the flow of sensory information to a trickle. The hippocampus, the brain's memory consolidation center, is beginning the long night's work of sorting and storing the day's experiences. And the inner voice, that constant companion, is fading not into absence but into a different kind of presence. A presence without words, without form, without the need to be anything other than what it is. In this fading, there is something that deserves to be called beautiful. The inner voice does not end with a period. It does not make a final declaration and fall silent. It dissolves the way a melody dissolves when you stop humming and the last note hangs in the air for a moment, before it becomes indistinguishable from silence. The words become fragments. The fragments become impressions. The impressions become a kind of warmth that has no name, a glow behind the eyes that is neither thought nor sleep, but the tender space between them, the place where you are still you, but the word you no longer means anything precise. There is a passage that every human being makes every night, and it is among the most extraordinary events in nature. The transition from waking consciousness to deep sleep involves the systematic dismantling of everything you think of as yourself. Your name loses its relevance. Your plans lose their urgency. Your worries lose their shape. The inner voice, which spent the entire day constructing and maintaining the edifice of your identity, consents to let it all go, trusting that the architecture will still be standing in the morning. This nightly surrender is an act of faith so profound that it would be terrifying if you were awake to witness it. But you are not awake. You are somewhere between, and the voice that might have been frightened is already too quiet to object. The delta waves are coming now, or they will come soon. These are the slowest and largest brain waves, rolling through the cortex in broad, synchronized pulses that represent the deepest stage of non-rapid eye movement sleep. In delta sleep, the default mode network is at its quietest. The sense of self is fully suspended. There is no narrator, no story, no past, no future, no inner voice rehearsing or reviewing or wishing things were otherwise. There is only the body, repairing itself at the cellular level, and the brain, consolidating memories and clearing metabolic waste, and a consciousness so minimal that it cannot be said to belong to anyone. You are, in delta sleep, as close to pure being as you will ever come while alive. And yet, even here, in the deepest well of sleep, something persists. The brain does not become silent. It becomes unified, its billions of neurons pulsing together in a slow rhythm that some researchers have compared to the breathing of the ocean. This is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of coherence, the silence that exists when every part of a vast system is moving together and there is no need for any part to speak above the others. The inner voice is not gone. It is resting within this larger rhythm, absorbed into a pattern so complete that individuality is, for the moment, unnecessary. Consider this as you drift. Every human being who has ever lived has made this same passage. Every mind that has ever narrated a life has consented each night to stop narrating. Every inner voice that has ever worried, planned, criticized, encouraged, or whispered "I love you" in the privacy of a single skull has, at the end of each day, released its grip and allowed something larger to hold it. You are joining a chorus of silence that stretches back to the first human who ever fell asleep, and forward to the last one who ever will. The inner voice connects you to yourself. The silence connects you to everyone. The voice is very quiet now, almost a memory of itself rather than an active presence. If you can still hear it, notice how thin it has become, how it no longer insists on anything, how it has stopped trying to mean and is content simply to be. A warmth, a rhythm, a familiar hum, dissolving into the hum of the body, the hum of the breath, the hum of something too large and too old to need a name. There is nothing left to learn tonight, nothing left to hold, nothing left to carry. The 100 quiet truths are settling into you like snow falling on still water, each one touching the surface and then becoming the surface, no longer separate, no longer facts, just part of the silence that was always underneath. Your inner voice began this journey as a companion, and it has walked beside you through the architecture of your brain, through the memories of your childhood, through the dreams you have not yet dreamed. It has shown you that it is physical, that it is inherited, that it is flexible, that it is brave enough to dissolve each night and trust that it will return. It is dissolving now, not into nothing, but into you, into the deep and wordless part of you that does not need a narrator, that does not need a name, that has been here since before your first breath and will outlast your last word. Let it go. Let the silence hold what the voice cannot, and rest in the vast, quiet country of your own mind.